Okay, good morning, everybody. My name is Ed Bierstone. I'm the director of the Fields Institute, and I'd like to welcome all of you to Random Walks, Music of Xenakis and Beyond. Random Walks is a festival of contemporary string quartet and percussion, as well as during the day, lectures and discussion on the impact of Xenakis' work. This event is part of the Fields Institute's 20th anniversary celebrations. The Institute is an international research center. Our mission is to advance research and communication in all areas of the mathematical sciences, including their impact on society and culture. Our programs bring over 4,000 registered visitors to Toronto every year, and we're really delighted to host the Xenakis Festival as part of our increasing engagement with the artistic community. This is actually a two-day program. The second part will take place tomorrow in Waterloo, organized by the Institute for Quantum Computing and Perimeter Institute. The program today includes noon and evening concerts at Walter Hall in the Faculty of Music of the University of Toronto. These concerts will feature Xenakis' complete string quartets performed by the Jack Quartet in their Toronto debut. Jack is one of the world's great contemporary string quartets, so I think this is going to be a real treat. The musical program has been organized by Professor Ayun Wong of the Faculty of Music at McGill University. Ayun is one of Canada's leading percussionists, and both the noon and evening concerts will include some of Xenakis' most important percussion works. The performers include Ayun herself and several other outstanding young percussionists, including some of her former students. The program of talks during the day has been put together to give an idea of the sweep of Xenakis' ideas and their influence both on contemporary music composition and performance, also on architectural design and technique. We'll have 3 lectures during the day by Sharon Kanach this morning, and by James Harley and Daniel Hambleton this afternoon, and we'll say a little bit about each of them before their talks. We're also very fortunate to have John Mighton here with us this morning to put the program in context with some personal reflections on mathematics and the arts, as well as to introduce some of the main speakers. John is a fellow of the Fields Institute, and he's very well known to many of you as a mathematician, playwright, and as the founder of Jump Math, which is a program for mathematics education that's having increasing impact on mathematics curricula in schools around the world. For his very diverse contributions to mathematics literacy and to the arts, John was named an Officer of the Order of Canada in 2010. So I hope you all very much enjoy the program of lectures and the concerts today. You're very welcome to join us for a reception in the atrium here at 5 o'clock this afternoon after the day's lectures. And we, of course, hope to see you at both concerts. John.
Thanks. I'm very honored to be able to talk to you today. I expect I was chosen because I try to do work in a couple of fields, in theater and in mathematics. And I just wanted to make a few remarks about, I think, what is really now a growing trend in the arts to fuse ideas from literature, from painting, from theater, and ideas from science. I mean, I can talk most about my own field, which is theater, In the past couple of decades, some of the most successful plays have been ones that have been inspired by science, particularly the play Arcadia by Tom Stoppard and the play Copenhagen by, I've had a terrible lapse of memory. Does anyone remember the name of the author of Copenhagen? But both plays, interestingly, they're not only inspired by science, but they take their structure from scientific ideas. So Arcadia was deeply influenced by chaos theory and has a kind of chaotic structure, and Copenhagen was influenced by ideas from quantum mechanics and especially ideas about indeterminacy, and the plot reflects that. And I think Xenakis was a real pioneer in this sense. There were not many people when he started working who had that interest. One of my great heroes, Beckett, did. Beckett's plays were deeply influenced by the scientific ideas of the time. But I think that this trend really started earlier and was deeply influenced by some ideas in the 1800s. And I just happened to be writing a play called Risk. Now I'm doing research for a play called Risk that's was inspired by a doctor, Semmelweis, who was working in Vienna, who, and at the time in the mid-1800s, there were epidemic death rates among women in maternity wards, and no one could understand it. They would sometimes, like 20% of a ward would be wiped out by these epidemics, and for years no one could do anything about it. And Semmelweis one day realized he was a very dutiful scientist, and he would go and dissect corpses in the morning of the women who died, and then he'd go and deliver babies in the afternoon. And nobody put it together, but finally he realized when one of his best friends died from an infection and he had symptoms exactly similar to the ones the women were dying from. He realized there may be a cause, and he did some of the first randomized controlled studies where he showed he could bring down the death rates by having doctors wash their hands using a very strong solution. But his work was largely ignored because people didn't really take account of those things at the time, and he died in an insane asylum. But what's interesting about that time, for the first time, people began to think of randomness, which has a huge element in the work of Xenakis, began to think of randomness as a force of nature. Until that time, it was kind of a sideline in mathematics, but there was a Belgian astronomer, Quetelet, who was one of the first people to apply the bell curve. And so he actually, there's a joke in my play, he actually looked at conscripts, people who had been called up into the French army, and he plotted their heights. He took a large number of conscripts and plotted their heights on a graph and compared it to the bell curve. And he found the distribution of heights wasn't matched with the bell curve. So he realized that a large number of French conscripts were lying about their height. Military service. And this is one of the first uses of the bell curve in that way. And that started a whole movement where people began to be fascinated with the force of randomness. They realized that if they looked at murder rates and suicide rates, they found that in every country of Europe there were the same proportion of people dying using the same instruments. And they began to think that our lives were being determined more and more by these random forces. And that way of looking at things really came to the fore with Einstein with his study of Brownian motion, which I think is going to be a large part of the talks today, and random processes. Brown, who was a botanist, looked at these pollen particles suspended in water and saw that they were weaving like a drunkard, these random walks. And Einstein was the first person to really come up with a mathematical explanation. He realized that if you looked at the behavior of large numbers of random particles, if you assume there were atoms hitting these little pollen particles, they would be hitting on all sides randomly in these random distributions, but sometimes there would be more particles hitting on one side, and that would force the pollen particles to move off in one direction, then more particles would hit on another side. And he was able to actually show for the first time the weight of atoms, how many atoms are in a mole, and so on, make all these predictions just using an analysis of large ensembles of random particles. So I think that I've always been fascinated as an artist about the boundaries of the imagination. It seems to me that up to the 1800s, artistic imaginations always outstripped the scientific imagination. Artists were always able to imagine a lot more, but around the 1800s that began to change. And more and more science, I think, has begun to define the boundaries of the imagination. So if you look at Einstein's theory of relativity, people could have imagined time moving at different rates for different observers, but no one happened to do it until that point. Even stranger results in quantum mechanics. No one had imagined that, the behavior, what you would find with groups of electrons would depend on what possibilities were open to those electrons, whether a door was open or not, even if the electron never went through that door. That the fate of that someone's life could be determined by whether a door was open that they weren't even near or didn't even go through. So those kind of ideas were unimaginable to artists, and I think that more and more, the reason artists are turning more and more to the sciences is because the world is mysterious in a way that really tends to transcend our imagination. And I think you see this trend really began to start around the time of Xenakis, with Xenakis, Beckett, and people like that, who were able to capture the feel of what it was like to live in a universe that is driven by random forces. And I think this is the beginning of this movement with this music. So the last thing I want to just mention is two things. There was a conference here recently by the Cognitive Science Network, which is a new institute set up at the Fields to look at the implications of cognitive science in education, to understand how math is an embodiment of the way our brains work. And a lot of that conference was dedicated to notation and the importance of notation in determining mathematical ideas. This is a very interesting topic for me. My supervisor, Louis Kaufman, who's a knot theorist, spoke at the conference, and he's one of the most creative and brilliant people at using unusual notations, drawings of knots, diagrams, and so on, to actually make profound mathematical discoveries. And these drawings actually condition the way you think about things. These little sketches on paper can actually lead to very deep results. And I've been fascinated looking at the notation of Xenakis, these new ways of scoring music. I know very little about it, but I would expect it's an extraordinarily interesting area to look at, how a notation could affect music also. And I know we'll be hearing about that today. And the final thing is, I've always wondered why there isn't more of this interchange between the arts and the sciences. And I think that also has something to do with the bell curve. We've been doing Jump in the charity. In Jump, the charity I started, looking at what kids' real potential is in mathematics. And we did one study where a teacher took a group of students where there was a very wide bell curve, a very wide distribution of marks of kids coming into grade 5. They had kids as low as the 9th percentile on these standardized tests, as high as the 75th, and the average mark was in the 54th percentile. So that's a pretty wide bell curve, and it's universal. In every grade 5 class I've observed, you see that difference between kids. The top and the bottom, the kids who are faster, the kids who will never do math. And we've really accepted that as a society as natural. And a year later, after using our program, the kids were in the 98th percentile, with the lowest in the 95th. And a year later, they all wrote the Pythagoras math competition, and 14 of the 17 got awards of distinction. So they're a very different class, and they love mathematics. I went and visited them one day. They were making conjectures. They were yelling out answers. They taught me something about division that I'd completely forgotten. And it was the entire class, not just the top few who were willing to put their hands up. And I've seen this, I even seen this in some of the most violent schools I've ever seen in my life. I taught kids in Brixton in England how to read binary codes, behavioral students in grade 5 and 6. And they all thought they were little code breakers. They wanted longer and longer codes because they weren't afraid to learn. And at the end of the lesson, another lesson like that, they all cheered. They were just so excited. From what I've seen, kids are born with this universal sense of wonder and curiosity. They love solving puzzles, seeing connections, appreciating the deep elegance of both art and science and mathematics. They're born with this sense of wonder, and what I think tends to diminish it is failure, or these anxieties develop because people think that they're not good at things. In fact, there's research done by Carol Dweck who's a psychologist, that shows that if kids have a growth mindset where they believe that their success depends on their efforts and their hard work, they do much better than kids with a fixed mindset who believe their success depends on an innate talent or an inborn talent. Because the kids with a fixed mindset tend to give up easily when they encounter difficulty, and they don't work because they think it's evidence that they don't have a talent. So, I mean, I think it's a deep issue in education and beyond. How do we develop a sense of growth mindset in children? If we could do that, I think we would have a culture where the arts and sciences are much more integrated, and that both areas would be drawing much more inspiration from each other, and people would be able to understand much more of what's happening in both areas, and it would enrich our experience of the arts. So that's a dream, and I hope, I think with this growing interest in that interchange, there's a chance it may happen within our lifetime. So I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Sharon Kanach, who was the founder of the Xenakis Project for the Americas. She collaborated for many years, for the past 20 years, the last 20 years of Xenakis' life with him, particularly on his extensive body of writing, and was also the general editor of the Iannis Xenakis series at the Pendragon Press. I hope I pronounced that right. And she'll be talking about Xenakis as a person, and also about how he was able to draw on so many fields, engineering, mathematics, and music, to really change the course of musical history. So, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, John, for a very fascinating introduction, and I really want to pick up some of the discussions that you sort of just touched upon, and in particular, art sciences alloys, which can almost be read as Xenakis' Rosetta Stone for those who are not aware of his writings. The main argument of this is the necessity today to create, to teach the arts and sciences in a spirit of an artist conceptor. And this, and that was a translation that he insisted upon, because artiste concepteur, I was tending to say conceptualizer or something else, and he said no, it's really much more of a scientific method that should be used when teaching the arts also, but that all of the artists should be aware of mathematics, architecture, the sciences, and everything. He himself wanted to study the sciences, to come to America when he left Greece. And we'll get into some of those details a little bit later. His idea was to come to America to study the sciences originally, and do music more on the side. But those are a lot of informal discussions, I think, that we can have kind of off the record. What I wanted to talk to you about today, on the suggestion of Ed, was to give you a little more background about who is Xenakis, why is his music important today, as a model, indeed, as this artist conceptor, of someone who really bridged the two methods to create a new type of music, which is at the same time very, very personal. Play three notes of Xenakis and it's easily recognizable, and yet universal. There's something, and I think you'll all feel it today, and I think the choice of the string quartets, which is always kind of a nutshell of composer's opus, entire opus, is really a beautiful way of demonstrating Xenakis' entire work. And also the percussion instruments, as Steve Schick, a famous, wonderful American percussionist, wrote in Performing Xenakis here, any percussionist learning to play today must learn to play Xenakis, that he's become an inescapable entry into the world of percussion today. But before that, I just wanted to say that I, as John said, I met Xenakis in the late 70s in Paris, where I went to study with Nadia Boulanger, sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of more traditional musical training. And I was very surprised to meet him, because as a kid, I was aware of his music through one recording of the Oresteia, which is a almost an opera. It's sort of a musical setting of Aeschylus's trilogy. And when I heard, this was before, of course, the era of the internet, and someone had given me this record, and I adored it, and I just assumed that Xenakis died and was buried next to Aeschylus. And so when I was in the Paris Metro in the 70s and I saw that there was a Meet the Composer, I almost died. And because this music spoke to me in a way, as in a very archaic, very universal way, that it's timeless in a way. And I think maybe one of the reasons because of that can explain that is this relationship to the sciences, which is touching something that's universal. It's touching the way the world functions. So the talk today, the era of scientific and philosophical arts has begun. I don't know whether, do I have to stand in front of this, or with this thing I can move around a little bit? Well, I've got this thing on. Okay, excellent. The era of scientific and philosophical arts has begun is a quote from an article that Xenakis wrote in 1964 at the request of UNESCO, who asked him and a few other artists to reflect on what is the future of the arts, and music in particular. This article, unfortunately, as John has said, I've spent a lot of time during Xenakis' lifetime and since then publishing Xenakis' writings. And I thought we had a lot of the territory covered, the most important territory covered. I realized with a recent count that half of his written opus has not been translated yet, and this article in particular hasn't been. So I still have, stay tuned. There will be more to come in terms of his writings. But in this article, he argues for the innate relationship between mathematics and sciences, and as well as technology. He was one of the first pioneers to really see technology as a way of opening up and not restricting creativity. And at the time, that was quite revolutionary, because a lot of the artists, very much based in a more romantic vision, were terrified of the arrival of technology and computers in the world and encroaching on their territories, thinking that sort of the soul would be gone. And Xenakis saw technology rather as an opportunity to open up the creativity. So let's just give a quick overview of his life and his work for those of you who are not aware of it yet. He was trained as a civil engineer, and also an important point is to take the time during the breaks today to visit the exhibit, which is displayed out in the hallway here, because in less than an hour it's impossible for me to cover the biography and bibliography and discography and everything else of a creator as protean as Xenakis. So a lot of the details you'll see more in that. I'll try to give you a quick overview and then get into some details. He was born in 1922. So his wife says 21. He always lied about his age. Talk about the bell curve. In Romania, of Greek parents. His father was an affluent businessman, and his mother had an acute sensibility for music, but she died while giving birth to a daughter who also died in childbirth when Iannis was 5 years old. And this was a very important event for him. He was the eldest of 3 sons, and the father then sent the boys to a private Anglo-Greek boarding school in Spetse, on the island of Spetse near Athens, where both sports and Greek classics were emphasized. And although he was attracted to music early on, his father insisted that he, as the eldest of a partially orphaned family, trained for a proper career. So he entered the Athens Polytechnic the day the war broke out, but nevertheless pursued his studies there to become a civil engineer in 1947, writing his final thesis on reinforced concrete. And this, testing the resistance and limits of materials, seems to have pervaded his entire philosophy of life. Concurrently, he was an important member of the student resistance, first against the Nazis and then against the English, and he led the student faction whose code name was Lord Byron. He was nearly fatally wounded when shrapnel blew away about half of his attractive face, and he was imprisoned several times but was finally able to escape with falsified papers obtained thanks to his father's connections. As I said before, his original destination was to the States, where his brother Jason was already installed and teaching philosophy in Louisiana, but he only saw the U.S. much later. He ran out of money and serendipitous and fortuitously found work as an engineer in the Corbusier studio. He ran out of money, but he did have his engineering degree in his pocket still. He claimed he never knew or ever even heard of Le Corbusier to that day. He thought that architecture died with the ancient Greeks. He spent 12 years in Le Corbusier's studio, all while pursuing his musical studies and enjoying his first compositional successes and scandals. In addition to his application of various mathematical principles to music and his pioneering activities in electroacoustic and computer-generated music, we also owe him his iconic polytopes, where music, light, movement, text, architecture can all mingle independently yet intimately in a total spectacle, or as he called his last polytope, the diatope, music to be seen. Today, these can clearly be seen as precursors of the new darling of contemporary creation, new media art, or integrated art manifestations. I believe Daniel Hambleton will be talking in much more detail about that later today. And not unlike his musical peers, Stockhausen, Feldman, Luigi Nono, Ligeti, Xenakis also devoted considerable energy to writing his essays. And although he published several books, they're all compilations of independent articles, including Formalized Music. They were all just, he sort of cut and paste them together afterwards into a book form. As I said, I was amazed with a recent count to see that he had written as many articles as he had written pieces of music. So this theoretical exploration was equally important to him. And again, half of the articles need to be translated yet. But we did begin our collaboration with Art Sciences Alloys, which is here, and feel free to come up and look at these afterwards. Formalized Music is kind of his seminal theoretical work. Music and Architecture was a book we basically co-authored, and it really was a revelation for me, who had worked with Xenakis already for a fair amount of time when we started working together. He was very compartmentalized. I'm a musician, he's a musician. When working on Formalized Music, I don't know whether I dare say this at the Fields Institute, but he kind of dog-eared some of the Schwamm series books, saying, learn this, that's all you need to know. So it was quite a revelation for me to see how deeply involved he was in architecture, and this thinking, even though he was less involved later in his life, the thinking pervaded the actual act of writing music. And that was his very, very last project before he died, was creating this book together. Then afterwards, we, at the Pendragon Xenakis series, we decided that his performing Xenakis is a very scary thing for many young musicians. He has the reputation of being unplayable, and yet he's one of the most recorded composers, contemporary composers, or I was going to say living. In a way, his music is keeping him very much alive. So it's dauntingly difficult, and I thought it was time to gather some testimony from a lot of his dedicatees to demystify, in a way, the process of learning his music. So that was kind of, and there's some beautiful testimony about the man also, because there's a biography actually of Nadia Boulanger called The Tender Tyrant, and I would say that this idea of tender tyrant is almost as applicable to Xenakis as well. He was very timid, yet he was extremely demanding, extremely demanding. As I said, with the reinforced concrete, testing materials, his life was constantly testing his own abilities, and those who worked with him, we were constantly tested also, and he demanded that we go beyond our capabilities. When I mentioned the cut and paste way of working that Xenakis had when creating Formalized Music, this very important book, Benoit Gibson, a Canadian musicologist, brilliant scholar, meticulous musician, has identified this cut and paste idea in Xenakis' music, and it's quite revealing to see how much he relied on self-borrowing to take something beyond. He would use material that was produced in an earlier piece and expand upon it later. And then Xenakis Matters is the result of an exhibit that we had done in 2010, beginning in 2010 till the end of 2011, that was sponsored by the Drawing Center Museum, private museum in New York City, then traveled to Montreal to the Canadian Center for Architecture, then to the LA MoCA, then to the Holland Festival, and then to Berlin. But for the 3 North American venues, we organized with absolutely no budget, just so they weren't really officially symposia. We had no means to do an official call for papers or anything like that. But through word of mouth and quite an active Xenakis network in North America, we were able to throw together 3 forums. And I was blown away by the quality and the novelty of some of the approaches that were being presented in these forums, showing how Xenakis was really at the heart of something, and that people now are taking these ideas and making them their own, and really changing the landscape of artistic creation these days. He said to Varga, there's a very interesting book, which is difficult to find now. I think it's out of print, but it's in most libraries, Conversations with Xenakis, with Valent Varga. And Xenakis said that in this book, that his main contribution to music is that he's introduced ideas alien to music into the compositional realm. And I think this is why he is really a precursor, and really kind of the model that John was alluding to earlier, where composers don't just write notes anymore. Composers are thinking about other things. Although electroacoustic and computer-generated music represent only 10% of his entire catalog, 2 characteristics should be pointed out about his involvement in this area. Number 1, it was something he did throughout his career, and Jim talks about this beautifully in his book, Jim Harley. He never chose either instrumental or electronic music, which many composers did in the 50s when electronic music sort of hit the scene. And unlike his European counterparts, working in the studio with computers never provoked a stylistic disruption. It always seemed a natural next step in his growing maturity as an artist. Nothing, musically speaking, ever seems predictable from the system he employs. His first electroacoustic work dates from 1957, called Diamorphose, 3 years after his breakout music work, Metastasis. And his last work, S709, is from 1994, only 3 years before his ultimate work, Omega, for ensemble and percussion, from 1997. And even after he closed once and for all the door to his personal studio where he wrote, he continued for a while to go to the Semamu, the research center he created in 1972. Another point that is worth mentioning, I think, is that there's no stylistic change between his instrumental music and his electronically generated pieces. And we'll be able to hear that in the concerts between the string quartets and the percussion music and Concret PH, which will be played tomorrow in Waterloo. His music remains distinctive and recognizable regardless of the medium or the instrumentation. When Xenakis' Metastasis was published in 1963, I believe, almost 10 years after it was written, he wrote in the introductory notice of this score something that has always intrigued me, and I quote, "This work was also an attempt to demonstrate at the time that the human orchestra was capable of outclassing, in the matter of new sonorities and in finesse, the new electromagnetic techniques which were threatening to oust them." So, and he had already worked quite a bit in electroacoustic music at this point in 1963. And so there is this intimate conviction as well that the unheard of sounds that everyone was searching for in electroacoustic music was still possible through new explorations in orchestral writing or instrumental writing in general. So, to sum it up, in 1955 to 62, he was a member of the GRM, the Groupe de Recherche Musicale, which was founded by Pierre Schaeffer and Pierre Henry to research and develop the idea of musique concrète, music composed of recorded found sounds. Xenakis was less attracted to the objets sonores that they were all after than he was to the means to synthesize them, to create these unheard of sonorities. Concrète PH was written for the Philips Pavilion, which he designed under Le Corbusier for the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels, and it's his second work composed at the GRM. The raw materials for this piece consist entirely of recordings of burning charcoal, no more, no less. And it's a pity Curtis Rhodes was forced to cancel his presentation, because I think it's really kind of a groundbreaking work in terms of what became granular synthesis afterwards. And Curtis is really the person to talk about that, because he was the man who caught that ball and started running with it and still is running with it. In 1956, Xenakis wrote his famous article, Probability Theory in Music Composition, and he begins working on a computer program of stochastics, which he called the ST program. And we will be hearing ST4, I believe this afternoon, with the Jack Quartet. And it's quite an amazing piece, because actually it's based on this computer program that was finally finished with the IBM 7090, which was quite a coup at the time. Xenakis managed to get a couple of hours and on the IBM 7090 in Paris. And didn't have that much time. And so from those first results was developed there's ST4, ST10, ST48, and a few other pieces that were based on this program. But ST4 is actually a transcription of ST10. So not only is it this really new language that's happening, it's also a transcription that normally is played by 10 people for 4 people. So it's quite a tour de force for the Jack, who play it magnificently. In 1960, he created with Abraham Moles and Michel Philippot and Alain de Chambure the MIAM. So it's Michel, Iannis, Abraham Moles. That's the MIAM, to research specifically math and music. In 1963, I believe it's the first time he came to America. It was Aaron Copland who invited him to come to Tanglewood. And it's here that he had kind of a first revelation about his sieve theory. And which enabled him to start distinguishing operations, musical operations, which he called in time or outside of time. And I think Jim will be talking more about that in detail. And Persifassa, which we will be hearing tomorrow in Waterloo in the outdoor concert, which is a fantastic piece, not only examines the whole idea of spatialization, which as an architect was an important aspect of things for Xenakis, but also the idea of the sieve theory of creating new types of scales. In tonality, it would be non-octavating scales, but there was also something that he was applying to rhythmic scales, and Persifassa certainly explores that. In 1966, he created the MAMU, Études Mathématiques Automatiques Musicales. And interestingly enough, he asked Claude Lévi-Strauss to be a member of the board. So already bringing in a more humanistic approach, very scientific, very musical, but also from an anthropological point of view, and not just pure science. Between 1967 and 1972, he was teaching at Indiana University in Bloomington, where he was promised the golden carrot of having the most state-of-the-art computer music center at his disposal. But year after year, it got postponed, and then finally he quit and came back to France and transformed the MMU into CMMU, and actually was able to get some significant funding from the French Ministry of Culture, which had been refused to him at that point, up until that point, which is one of the reasons why he stayed in France. In 72, he began teaching at the University of Paris, and the course there was called Formalization and Programming in Visual Arts and Music. And this is coming out of this work that he was already doing with the polytopes. The first one that he did was in 1967 in Montreal, actually, at Expo. And then in 71, 72 was the Polytope de Cluny, famous, that drew hordes. I think there were like 100 or 200,000 people who came to see this thing. It was wildly popular. And so he working from formalized music, was applying this then to all of the arts. In 1977, from this MMU was born the first UPIC. The UPIC was, and still is, remains today, because we have now the Centre Iannis Xenakis in France, based at the University of Rouen. This is our main asset, in a way, is this musical drawing board that Xenakis developed very much as a personal tool. You'll see a little later on some of the way he was sketching. You were talking about notations before, John. And he was a fine, beautiful draftsman. And so it was very natural for him to draw. And so he had imagined from the time he was doing the original sketches for Metastasis, how could he create, could there be a machine that could translate this into sound without having to go, for him to transcribe it into traditional notation, and hence the UPIC was born. And lo and behold, not only was it an extremely interesting tool for himself, it was also of great appeal to other composers, but unbeknownst to him originally, it has become and remains an incredible tool for teaching kids how to do music. Any kid can draw a house, and house can become a sound, can have a sound equivalent. And suddenly kids are totally demystified by the whole solfeggio method. And, you know, especially in France, it's terrible. Kids have to spend like 3 years doing solfege before they can actually play an instrument. So by the time they get to the point of being able to play the instrument, they don't want to play it anymore. They hate it. It's, and so this is a fantastic, and it's kind of, teetered out after Xenakis died, and then there were some administrative problems, and it's only recently, only the past year or two, that we've taken up this activity again, and we are overwhelmed with demands from all over the country in France. It's kind of spreading like a wildfire, and already have projects to come and be in UPIC, to be in residency at the Conservatory in McGill. Everybody's sort of rediscovering the fact that, well, maybe you don't have to do solfege to become a musician. In 1985, this was the result of the demand at the time for this machine. Xenakis, it was extremely expensive to create this machine. The first one in the 70s, it was like $50,000, which was a lot of money at that point. And there was one machine, and since it was in demand all the time, it was traveling, and he couldn't work on it. And so the French Ministry of Culture in 1985 decided that they would help him create a second association, nonprofit association, that would be able to travel and do the promotion of this machine, leaving his baby at home so that he could work, and other composers could work in Paris on it. In 1991, he developed a dynamic stochastic synthesis program called GENDI, relating back to his original stochastic principles, And one of the projects we have also at the Xenakis Center now is to fulfill an idea that he was never able to fulfill before his death, and that is to combine the UPIC and the GENDI program using probabilistic drawing methods and programming. But before all of that, there is Xenakis' relationship to nature. As a solitary young adult, he enjoyed camping in Attica, immersed in the elements, often talks about it in his writings, though his writings can be very obtuse. They're almost systematically filled with very poetic images. At somewhere in the paragraph, you will see the poet in the man. He said to an interviewer for The Wire in a little known interview that was published in 1995, quote, "The stochastic method was necessary when I started writing, metastasis or pithopracta especially. I used systems that scattered formal notes from the string orchestra all over the spectrum. That was the vision I had of music, like rain or clouds, and the human mind is made out of these things. So it was not a translation, but a personification of these kinds of thoughts." In other words, he didn't content himself with merely the poetics behind the natural phenomena, but sought out rational explanations of both their occurrence and the impact they had on him. These rational methods then spurred his imagination even further, creating a new catalyst for self-liberation and intellectual stimuli. In Art Sciences Alloys, he states, quote, "Mathematics plays an essential role as a philosophical catalyst, as a molding tool for forming auditory and visual edifices, but also as a springboard towards self-liberation," unquote. In a personal letter to Hermann Scherchen, the conductor and a great supporter of Xenakis during his lifetime, in 1958, as a young composer, he wrote to Scherchen, quote, "Music for me is philosophy. It is the sonic projection of stars, of machines, and of human sensitivity. For me, music is the projection in sound of tumultuous and vertiginous modern thinking. What I try to do is to organize in perceptible form the harmonies and dissonances of modern life. Once upon a time, shepherds listened to birds and insects and were inspired. It is the same process, but in a radically different way." And just as a side, I can guarantee you that Xenakis subscribed to Scientific America and not Musical America. Another major influence on him was his war experiences. He said in the same interview in 1995 to The Wire, "I discovered things about sound that I was not taught, that no one had told me. People shouting in waves. It's a very special experience. I was there in December 1944 when the communist resistance was suppressed by the British troops. I was fighting against the British as I fought against the Germans. What was interesting were the bullets in the night, whistling, and explosions here and there, and also the searchlights trying to spot the planes. That was with the Germans. It was a large-scale spectacle that was very, very interesting." So from his years and experiences as an active member of the resistance, first during World War II and then during the Greek Civil War, Xenakis later transcribed this personal battle into the field of ideas. Pithopracta translates as actions through probability. He consistently claimed to me that he found pithopracta much more important and revolutionary than metastasis, and never understood why everyone was, everybody's pet Xenakian work was metastasis. But there are certain features such as the glissandi and mass events that are common to both. And even though the title does mean actions through probability, his biographer, Nuritza Matusim, says, "Pithopracta is no more a translation of probability theory than an artichoke or celery heart is a translation of the Fibonacci series." And elsewhere, she adds, "It joyfully demonstrates his capital discovery that music is a medium for thinking." what's the little thing on the bottom there is actually from a plan, an architectural plan he was working on at Le Corbusier studio at the same time for the Fermini Cultural Center. And just as a doodle, you see Pitheaupracte sort of coming to his mind while designing a cultural center. What I'd like to do now is get out of this and into this and show you what, in the exhibit I mentioned before, the Drawing Center exhibit, we created a listening station. There were many archival materials that were not able to travel from the BNF because they were too fragile. Xenakis had the habit of doing a lot of these sketches on tracing paper, often in pencil as well, and they just couldn't be taken out of the reserves. So we did for Pitheaupracte high-def, I'm sorry, I have some Dropbox activity happening right now. I'm not quite sure how to stop that. And so these are sketches, these are actual sketches that Xenakis did. It's a choice of, I think there are 212 in all sketches for Pitheaupracte. And this is kind of a random film put up with the music behind it. And I'll show you afterwards that how all of this was transcribed into traditional music notation. So all of these sketches, whether they're graphic or calculations or whatever, everything is finally, in order to be playable, is transcribed in perfectly traditional music notation. Because this is one point, John, when you were talking about notations. It's true that there are kind of notational methods that Xenakis used, but for his personal reason, everything was finally transcribed into traditional music notation, except for, of course, the UPIC scores. And the UPIC scores, there is one of the listening stations in the exhibit was to do kind of follow the bouncing ball, his sketches going through the electronic pieces, but they were not really meant to be seen. So going back to this. In 1976, Xenakis, the first edition of Musique Architecture was was published. Just pass these around. And in it, it actually has it has almost nothing to do with music and architecture, because in the English edition of the books, things got moved from one title to another, and the formalized music that you see here is twice as thick as the formalized music that was originally produced in French. So he was very open about using formalized music and music architecture as kind of generic titles that could be filled in with as new material was being developed. So this from 1976 is a table that he created linking music to mathematics. Unfortunately, it's never really been updated since then. We produced it in Art Sciences Alloys at his request, and at that point, when we started working on it, it was the early 80s, so he really didn't see any reason to update it. But I think it would be really interesting for somebody at the Fields Institute, for example, to update this. And I think what's fun is that you see here, beginning in 1930, well, especially from 1950, 53, all of this, he's combining the two. We start out, we have music on the one hand, we have architecture on the other hand, but beginning in the 50s, they're joining the two. Not unsurprisingly, he's mentioning mainly what he's discovered, but I think that there are other people who have certainly contributed to this new alloy, as he's pleading for. And I just wanted to take something that he doesn't mention in this table as as something that coming from mathematical theory and going into music is game theory. Xenakis, the quote that we have here, explains why he's completely opposed to aleatoric music, mainly because he felt that there was some fundamental dishonesty on the part of composers transposing the responsibility of final choices to the performers, which from a musical point of view, why not? But he was even down to the point of saying, well, then they should share the royalties on it if the performing musicians are making the decisions. And I think it's interesting to see that this game theory seems to be his response to what the American school was developing at the same time in terms of chance music and purely graphic scores, sort of play what you see. He decided that by setting the rules of the game, and again, the music is very clearly written out. What he has created are game matrices where they are zero matrices. And the one in particular that I think is interesting, well, you have Duet, which was 1959. That was premiered 12 years after it was written only in Holland, and 1971. And this is why perhaps I think Xenakis revisited this in 1972 in Ligne Agon. Strategy, on the other hand, 62, was premiered at the Venice Biennale, and it was Simonovic and Bruno Maderna who were conducting. And Maderna claimed that it was unplayable unless the game had been decided ahead of time. So just avoiding the whole purpose of the thing. And of course, Maderna wanted to win. So this is when Xenakis was, it actually was taken on tour throughout the United States. It had, I don't know how many, Jim, do you remember how many performances it had? The St. Louis Symphony did a North American tour with Strategy. But as you can see, it was quite primitive. You have here, you know, like the game board up here as though it's a basketball game and the two opposing things. And these two fellows here are actually the referees and the umpires calculating. Right now we're working on a program with IRCAM to create an interactive DVD where everybody will be able to do their own Ligne Agon, but actually it would be, they're more or less the same game matrices in Strategy, so maybe we'll do it there as well. When Strategy was premiered in Paris in 1965, you can see here the musical boiling point reached. The Herald Tribune critic compares it to the premiere of The Rite of Spring in the same hall. So the problem with these pieces is that it does, I guess in a way it fulfills the idea of a game, but in a musical context it became more of a théâtre musical, and that he was totally opposed to. And this is why I think now with the technology available and everybody playing off of iPads rather than off of scores, it's quite easy to make it very beautiful music. It's a diversion as well for Xenakis, because he who always pleaded for abstraction in terms of being able to manipulate ideas rather than sentiments and this and that, in Ligne Agon he actually follows a narrative. Let's see, in the score he says, according to the legend, Linos, the celebrated musician, provokes Apollo, who strikes him down. Here the legend is incarnated by a musical game between two adversaries, Linos, the trombone, and Apollo, played by the French horn and/or the tuba. Contrary to the legend, this game gives a chance to Linos to extricate himself. This real chance is mathematically provided by decision matrices. To throw the gauntlet to the gods is not blasphemy, but it is to surpass them by surpassing oneself. So after a brief commencement, Linos challenges Apollo, then Apollo accepts the fight, and then there's a choice of combats, alpha, beta, gamma. Each combat follows its own matrix, columns for Apollo, rows for Linos, and then the real combat begins, tuba and French horn versus Linos, the trombone. It's possible to insert a quasi-unison interface between the different combats. This enables everybody to sort of recalculate what they're going to play, because normally it's the musicians really have to be able to keep an eye on the matrix, on the different possibilities that they have, and try to strategize what they want to do. Here Xenakis seems to abandon all drive towards pure abstraction that characterizes the large majority of his catalog and chooses to follow a specific narrative. His composerly choice or flair, as Jim has often said in his book, is more in allowing Linos the option to win eventually, rather than being doomed to his mythological state. So I wasn't able to get anything that was readable yet. Oof, I think. Yeah. But I'd just like to play the beginning. This is completely written out. The beginning, the commencement, and so that's just to give you a quick idea of the sound world. And I think it's really interesting when working on this DVD. Obviously, I had to do a lot of listening as well, and so without any visuals involved. And I just find the music stunning, absolutely stunning. And one's so used to seeing the performance and often in this sort of musical theater thing that I always wondered whether the piece was that interesting, but musically, when you just listen to the music, it's stunning. It's absolutely stunning. So stay tuned for the DVD, which will have visuals, but you can also turn off the visual part. So this is showing you a quick how much he was working at, even after the score was published. He was like rewriting the matrices. He really wanted them to Linos to have a fair chance. So to conclude, I think I've gone already a little bit over Xenakis said to Nuritsa, every piece of mine, his biographer, every piece of mine contains a philosophical question. What I hope to have demonstrated a little bit today is that every piece of Xenakis, every work of Xenakis is in fact an alloy between the arts and the sciences, whatever he's thinking about at that point. Music in Xenakis' hands becomes an experimental discipline, whereby, as he often reiterated, music can lead the way for the sciences. Each of his works provides an intellectual content that often engages several disciplines, yet never loses its aesthetic or even emotional impact. This is not due to his methods, I think, but rather to the man behind them. His belief and his model are both one where artists will be the ones able to dissolve and even obliterate the boundaries between the arts and the sciences. And that prophecy is why I would have found it fitting to leave the floor to Curtis Rhodes, who at the Nano Center is the director of the Allosphere in the nanotechnology department of the University of California at Santa Barbara. I find it very interesting that the nanotechnology department asked two artists to run the thing. Of course, they're working in terms of in aspects of sonification, and so it really makes sense that there are musicians that are there. But they are developing tools, I believe, that are surprising the scientists behind it. That's it, I think. If there are any questions, or okay.
Thank you very much for a beautiful introduction to Xenakis and to his use of ideas from mathematics. John for his very, very interesting remarks at the beginning. I think we still have time for a few questions that will make it possible to get to the main concert. So you're definitely welcome to Sharon.
How is the translation done from images to standard music? Are there trained people that do this?
Well, he did it.
He did it himself.
He did it himself. If you, it was a little bit hard to see because the lights were on. If the lights were off, everything is basically on graph paper, and the axis is a pitch axis, and the X and Y, it's pitch and time. It's pitch and time, and so it can be quite literally transcribed into traditional notation. There's not an interpretive buffer zone, really, for that. What the buffer zone, I think, came in the sketching process itself. If he didn't like the way it looked, he wasn't going to like the way it sounded, and he would often deviate from the results. This is one of the complaints that he had about algorithmic music, and you know, it kind of took off, and he was the model for that. But a lot of composers began contenting themselves with stopping their creative work when they finished the algorithm, and he was always arguing, well, where is the flair? Where is the composerly flair? So he would deviate, and I think the deviation process would be something that, at least in the early stages, is something that he would visualize first, and then transcribe.
Xenakis collaborate with musicians on musical techniques. Some of the things, for instance, storytellers.
Absolutely.
String players and flute players don't.
Yeah.
But they're cost.
Absolutely, and performing Xenakis is full of really funny testimony about some of the impossible passages. You know, he did write for notes that don't exist on the piano, and Roger Woodward, who was very close to Iannis, dedicated 3 pieces to him, and Roger would say, Iannis, well, should I just transpose it down an octave or something like that? And Iannis would shrug his shoulders and it's like, that's your problem. waiting for the next piano to develop. Remember that Beethoven had to wait a generation before everything could be played. Iannis had this strong belief that technology would also go into instrument making, and that pianos haven't stopped today. That why can't we have pianos with extra notes? But there are particularly interesting stories about his quartet. Several people mentioned this, that he would go into his closet and pull out his string quartet. And his string quartet was basically a plank, a 2x4 plank, where you had fingerings for the violin on one side, viola on the other side, cello on the other side, and bass on the other side. And so he would try, and he was a man, and a big man, and athletic, and so he had quite large hands, and would have, yeah, this is possible, yes, this is possible. Sure, in an isolated situation, everything was possible. But when you have, this tempo and like this, it becomes a little more difficult. But this was, again, the sort of Xenakian challenge of surpassing oneself. Elizabeth Chojnocka, also someone he dedicated 3 or 4 pieces to, harpsichordist. He had measurements of her hands. He reproduced the 2 keyboards of her harpsichord. And still, one day she called him up and said, Iannis, I can't do this. And he said, okay, then don't do it. And she said that made her so angry that then it just gave her the motivation to, I'm going to lick this.
John.
Listening to that last piece, I thought it would be great music for theater. I even thought of the piece I'm writing, that's probably between randomness and structure. And a lot of musical composers now for theater, I think are using those.
Mm-hmm. Well, as I mentioned, he did write in the 60s the music for the Oresteia, and then redid that. So that was like incidental music for the full thing. Then he reduced it to a suite, a 20-minute suite, and then later added two other pieces to it. Not that I know. A lot of people dance, and especially on the percussion music. There have been 2 or 3 major companies in the last 2 or 3 years that have been touring with Persifasa. But in terms of Jim, do you know of any?
Setting existing pieces. Yeah, I don't.
No. It's interesting. You get into the question of grand rights then, and that's always tricky as well. Because as long as it's music, but it's also with the dance, but then you have to ask for the rights, and it could get a little tricky. But it's worth a try. It's worth a try. I know he did Les Bacchantes. The Bacchae, again, incidental music for that. And it's quite a mystery because it's a very rarely performed piece. Again, it seemed the score isn't played very often because it's really hard to understand what you're supposed to do. There seem to be snips taken out, and I found a tape that Iannis obviously had given to me, like a cassette tape that I had completely forgotten about, and it was the actors were playing instruments, all of this, but it was never properly transcribed. I don't know who published the score. I don't think he saw it because it's basically unusable. But Greek theater in particular is something that he was very, very keen about.
Thank you. There'll be more opportunity to chat with Sharon this afternoon. I would like to thank her also and thank XPA, the Xenakis Project of the Americas exhibit, which is on display in the atrium here. It'll be here for another week. And I think the panels really have a lot of content. And if you haven't already spent some time on them, I think it's well worth doing it. So hope to see all of you at the concert at Walter Hall in a half an hour. If you're not familiar with the faculty of New York, maps outside, and it's only a 10-minute.